Crimes Minnesota will never forget.
They may not be stories you want to remember, but they remain part of our history. History that helped shape and mold our justice system, how we raise our children, even how we see the world. In a three-part series of special reports only on KTTC, our Beret Leone takes a look back at some of the state's most notorious killers and their crimes. Tonight, we start with a violent quadruple homicide. It happened right here in Rochester more than 33 years ago. Our Beret Leone joins us in our studio, and she investigates the Brahm Murders. Beret.
Well, Tom, Caitlin, when you think of notorious Minnesota crimes, the Brahm Murders are at the top of the list. For the first time, KTTC spoke with a close family friend of the Brahms. If you've lived in Rochester long enough, you've heard the name.
This is him on his way to prison. This is the last time Rochester saw him.
Brahm. You've probably read the headlines.
5 lives that are gone. I mean, they're literally gone.
Remember the reports?
The question Olmsted County authorities must decide now is whether to charge David Brahm as a juvenile or as an adult.
Watch the Brahm family murder story play out on national television.
Good evening. Topping tonight's News 11. Police charge a 16-year-old boy with 4 counts of first-degree murder after his family is found axed to death in their Rochester home.
Patty Price lived it.
It was a crazy, awful experience.
In the middle of the night on February 18th, 1988, 16-year-old David Brahm killed 4 of his family members. His parents, Bernard and Paulette, and younger siblings, 14-year-old Diane and 9-year-old Rick, all murdered with an axe.
I had only just been to their house for a sleepover the weekend before.
Price, an 8th grader at the time, remembers it vividly. Diane was her best friend.
I remember the day that she didn't show up. It was a Thursday, and she didn't show up that day, and I didn't really think that much of it.
She remembers her mother breaking the news to her that night.
I don't know how to tell you this, but Diane is dead. My life kind of was before that moment and then after that moment from that point on.
The next day, Price went to school alongside her classmates in a fog, even cleaning out Diane's desk with another friend.
I was convinced 100% that David was out. He had walked in on the murders and fled.
Before David turned himself in that Friday.
Even at that point, I was like, somebody's got a gun to his head. He was like a brother to me. I mean, he was nicer than my brothers, to be honest.
David was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder. Shock and grief saturated the Rochester community.
This is obviously the shock phase. It's beginning to set in.
It's just, a shock to the whole community. Everyone's talking about it, wondering why.
Come Monday, St. Pius bused students to the funeral.
I remember we had to sit with our class, and there were 4 caskets brought in, of course, all closed. All that I could think of what was on the inside of those caskets. What did the bodies look like? And it was just trauma after trauma. And no help to be found.
Olmsted County Sheriff Kevin Togerson was one of the first responding deputies on scene.
I got up maybe 4, 5, 6 steps, and then I could see 2 sets of feet laying at the top of the steps.
30 years later, in 2018, he spoke with KTTC about the day.
When this happened to the Brahm family, there was a very heightened response and involvement, and there was a lot of things going on. The schools were more involved, the school counselors were more involved, trying to help and support families and things like that.
But Price remembers that time in her life differently.
And I remember really people telling us not to talk about it.
It took her until her mid-30s before she felt she could talk about the tragedy publicly.
From age 13, when the murders happened, till age 32, was massively shaped by the murders.
All these years later, she says she's never once blamed David.
Have never had anything but compassion for him and wondered what the reason was. I have written to him a couple times over the years, probably about 6 times.
David is now 49 years old at the Minnesota Correctional Facility in Stillwater, and the motive behind his crimes is something he's never revealed.
I think everybody involved with that case asks themselves that question, and I have no answer.
But Price has her own ideas.
Well, I have all sorts of theories on what was happening with David, having to do with priests, to be honest. But David has never been willing to talk about it. He talks about how much he misses his family. He talks about how You know, he really regrets snapping the way he did, and he talks about how much they loved him, and he very much misses them.
Price is an advocate for mental health and a practicing psychologist here in Rochester. She says if it wasn't for the Brahm murders, she wouldn't be as compassionate or even in the same field she's in. She hopes to get the courage to visit David at the Stillwater facility someday. If you'd like to hear more of her interview, head to KTTC.com. And I'll continue our three-part series tomorrow night looking into a case that haunts parents to this day. Join me tomorrow at 10 for the Jacob Wetterling case and how it has changed missing children cases today. Tom, Caitlin, this is a case that for so many years left Minnesotans and people across the country, for that matter, wondering if it would ever be resolved. The year is 1989.
This is where it happened, less than a mile from Jacob's house. It's back over that way. Jacob, his little brother, and one other boy had gone to a convenience store to rent a videotape. When they reached this spot, they saw the man dressed in black holding the gun.
Jacob didn't return home that night, and his whereabouts would remain a mystery for the next 27 years.
They did everything right. There was no way he should have been abducted.
Former Mayo Clinic pediatrician and co-founder of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Dr. Daniel Broughton, became close to the Wetterlings shortly after Jacob's abduction.
The story was really, really frightening and poignant and rare.
After he went missing, the St. Joseph community was on edge.
School bike racks, normally full, were almost empty today because so many parents escorted their children to school.
We have to protect them.
Well, now we have a new deadbolt.
And the search for Jacob was on.
Jacob Wetterling was part of all of our children's history in Minnesota.
From flyers, billboards, and even music.
Day after day, Jacob's song is sung and played here.
Still missing tonight, Jacob Wetterling, age 11.
Home soon. He had to feel that, you guys. He's coming home soon.
Hope that Jacob would return home remained.
Patty and Jerry wouldn't move just in case Jacob would show up someday.
People were still concerned until the day he was found.
For us, Jacob was alive until we found him.
Until September 2016.
It's always been, where's Jacob? And then suddenly Jacob's been found, and it's just something is really hard to get your head around.
53-year-old Danny Heinrich was the man that took Jacob, molesting him before fatally shooting the 11-year-old.
Finally, we know. We know what the Wetterling family and all of Minnesota have longed to know since that awful night in 1989.
Heinrich led police to Jacob's burial, a farmland across the highway and just a town over from St. Joe's.
That was a hard time on everybody. And I won't go into the law enforcement issues, but there were some. Maybe it could have been solved, years before that. Maybe it should have been. It's always hard to know.
Nearly 3 years after Jacob was found, Patty Wetterling remains a board member for the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children.
And she became such a spokesperson, so it ended a chapter, but they were so involved at that time, they just kept going.
While Jacob's story is heartbreaking, the legacy he leaves behind fuels exactly what fueled those looking for him those 27 years. Hope.
His legacy will go on.
And a lot has changed since 1989, and Jacob's story does play a part in that. When Dr. Broughton started the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, about 66% of cases were resolved. Today, that number has jumped to 95%. Dr. Broughton says there are 3 societal differences in how we raise our children in present day. The first is related to stranger danger, the second, tattling, and the third is the role our online world plays. I'll have more of that discussion on KTTC.com. And tomorrow at 10, I'll have our final piece in this 3-part series. Join us for a look into the weepy-voiced killer, only on KTTC. The weepy-voiced killer is a serial killer who got his name by what he did following the crimes. Police were stumped by a man who was begging to be caught. Before we show you this story, we want to give a warning to our viewers. You may find some of this footage disturbing. In the early 1980s, Minneapolis and St. Paul were terrorized by a violent offender.
At the beginning of 1981, it was the first time I covered Paul Stefani. Didn't know who he was back then, but I was working New Year's Day, and a young woman, Karen Potak, had been brutally beaten almost to death in St. Paul.
Karen Potak, beaten with a tire iron and left for dead, barely survived. Soon, crime started sharing characteristics. All women, all wearing the color red, and all with one person wanting to work with police to catch the predator.
Please don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry, I killed that girl.
The assailant himself.
At that point, they knew they had a serial killer.
A budding crime reporter at WCCO, Caroline Lowe, had an idea.
I asked the police chief if I could put the audio of a phone call they had to their phone center. It was very distinctive, and I was sure that once the viewers heard it, they would know who it was.
We're hoping that somebody will recognize the voice.
We put the audio on. He couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, but he kept saying, please, please, come help me.
A special direct line has been set up now, and the police are asking anyone with any information on this case to call.
Nothing came of that, and then about 5 months later, another person was attacked, and actually she died. It was Kimberly Compton.
18-year-old Compton was stabbed and killed with an ice pick.
Can you find me? I just stabbed somebody with an ice pick. I can't stop myself. I keep killing somebody.
The tearful phone calls soon dubbed the attacker as the weepy-voiced killer, and the patterns continued.
Officials say at this point they have not been able to positively identify the voice of the caller.
The man behind the voice remained a mystery, and another woman was savagely murdered. 40-year-old Barbara Simons, stabbed more than 100 times. But the serial killer would eventually be identified as Paul Michael Stefani. He was caught in 1982 after stabbing Denise Williams with a screwdriver. Williams survived.
What's the address? I don't know. Who are you?
And recognizing the weepy voice, Stefani was caught when he called for medical help and sentenced to prison.
He always denied, even though he called in and confessed and told people where to find the victims, he'd always denied.
Until December 19th, 1997.
And I couldn't believe it.
While serving time and with less than a year left to live, Stefani confessed to multiple murders, even one police hadn't connected him to.
He had details that only the killer knew.
Before Stefani's death, Lowe interviewed him in prison.
It's very unusual. Very few people I have covered, people I've interviewed in prison, have ever admitted to the crimes they're convicted of.
Stefani asked Lowe for his victims' addresses. He wanted to apologize and send flowers. Lowe declined.
Now, we've just shown you 3 of Minnesota's most notorious killers and their crimes. The good part about these 3 cases is that there is some sort of resolution. It may have taken years for some, but the killers convicted of these crimes are or already have served time for their infamous crimes. But there are families that don't have that resolution, that don't have answers about what happened to their loved one. One of those stories is Jody Huizentrout. While not a Minnesota case, Huizentrout was a Minnesota native. She went missing more than 25 years ago on her way to work as a morning news anchor in Mason City, Iowa. She's never been seen or heard from since. Lowe, who was featured in the last 2 pieces, has made it her mission to find Jody. For more information on these featured crimes or Jody's cold case, head to KTTC.com.